Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves. I'm Program Officer at the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library. And I'm being joined today by Dr. Deirdre Evans-Pritchard. And thank you so much for joining me today, Deirdre.
I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, it's great. I'll just briefly introduce you. You have a very deep and varied CV. Briefly, Dr. Evans-Pritchard teaches art history and film studies at the University of Maryland Global and is executive director of the DC Independent Film Festival. And Evans-Pritchard has deep experience as a scholar and maker of media, and most recently as curator and developer of Screentime, an interactive exhibition for which I hope we'll be able to talk about more today. Deirdre, thank you so much once again. And let's start with your project. What was it that brought you to Hagley?
So it's interesting where you end up, I think is what I would say. I will
Sure.
say with a certain amount of embarrassment, I didn't have much knowledge of Hagley as a library. But when I started looking for some information, there indeed it popped up. And so I have been working in the area of media literacy in a very general sense. And one aspect of that has been to sort of trace some of the history of media literacy, where it came from. And I felt this was relevant at a time at which we're starting yet again another session of what is media good for us? Forcefully came up, I think, in this last year of questions of, do we know what we're reading online is true? That's a whole media literacy question. And that whole sense of, now that we all talk to each other as we are right now, what does that also mean? Does it alter our identities, our assumptions of communication? This is fodder for academics for years. So in that process, I'm very interested in the work of Marshall McLuhan, the great sort of philosopher and English literature teacher and sort of visionary, eccentric, highly controversial. People loved him or hated him. And in my huntings around, I found that he had actually, in 1951, he had been invited by the US government to produce, with a few other people, research on the first ever media literacy syllabus designed for schools. And this was a fascinating idea. And I thought, oh gosh, so they're actually thinking about this. And from that, I started reading more of his work and realizing he was looking at the impact of, because of the timing, the impact of the change of media from one to another. And he was particularly interested, as it came out in his book shortly afterwards, about understanding media in that movement from print to television. And somewhere lurking in there, in that book, I can't remember where it is, he quotes David Sarnoff as exactly what he dislikes. I thought was pretty interesting. So I started researching David Sarnoff, and that indeed is what led me to Hagley, because you have a phenomenal connection about RCA, about him himself, about his son, about people who made the televisions, about people who, John Vossoff, who designed them. I mean, you've got a whole load of stuff, and that's what brought me to you.
Well, perhaps you could tell us who is or was David Sarnoff.
So David Sarnoff was quite a character. He was a classic immigrant to the United States, coming from Russia, came without much education, and rose to become the head of RCA, and technically the head of NBC, the television station that we still have a little bit left of today,
Right.
Though he did hand it over to somebody else, but technically it was under him. And he is, as early as the sort of early 1930s, he was labeled, I'm not sure who labeled, I have yet to find that one out, labeled him the father of television. And he, as far as I can tell, he loved that, right? I mean, I don't think this was a man without ego. And he, even though he wasn't actually the father of television, and so he would occasionally acknowledge that Marconi actually invented it, and that indeed people in Europe were ahead of him, but he did it as little as possible because he was also a consummate businessman. And so he built this RCA and dominated after the war, literally dominated the television world in the United States. I mean, a phenomenal process of not just commercial talent, but of introducing something that people were really suspicious of, right? And getting them to stick it in their sitting rooms.
By which you mean television itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Those sets, you know, people didn't want them there. But, you know, he just championed it. It was phenomenal.
Well, what sort of concerns did people have about introducing televisions to their lives?
So the first one, which he spent quite a lot of time telling people was not true, was that radio would collapse. And indeed, that's interesting because Marshall McLuhan was pretty hung up about that too. And so he wanted everybody to know that because television was coming, radio would not have to go. And he did it by making sure that the first television stations, were actually also radios. You could do both. So that he made that transition, and he continued to make them look into the 60s as if they were a little hangover from the Victorian era. You know, they all looked kind of a little dated. And he just simply shoved the screen in there and said, oh, well, you can have the TV or the radio. And so he managed to, I mean, there was huge amounts of advertising going on as well. And so that was a key way in which he convinced people how to do it. And then he very cleverly controlled the licensing system. It actually went into a big court case down here in DC, where I live. And he won this case, giving him the right to have slightly controlled, limited licensing arrangements with stations across the country. And so thus soon RCA was what you got.
And what was the nature of McLuhan's critique of this development?
So yes, that's interesting, because McLuhan, I assumed that he hated Sonoff. And I went into the Hagley Library assuming that there might possibly looking for his Sonoff's philosophy, because he was a very intelligent man, and he had many intelligent people working with him. It was a very impressive place, RCA. And I was looking to see where he stood, to see if there was some strong position, because he did give a lot of public speeches. He was very well connected in Washington, DC, and he was asked a lot to talk. So McLuhan's line, you know, was basically, what he critiqued was the argument that the set, the medium, television itself, is not responsible for any issues or problems. It's the same argument with which people say it's not the gun's fault. The gun is just a gun. It's whoever picks up the gun and shoots it. And he used that approach to TV. You don't blame TV because it exists and because we created it. It's how you use it that's the issue. And this was a very sort of smart line from him. I think it actually covered a lot of issues, because this was the time he was really moving into education as well. So this happened at the same time that he was actually developing the very first television stations in universities. And so the question of exactly how much that was connected was a big issue, you know, because he was replacing print. And so McLuhan argued, his main argument is, of course, that that's not the case. The medium is the message, and that it is not just about content and use. The actual medium impacts how people think and behave. And that was his line. And so they were dependent on each other's views, but they were very different. One was very different than the other. And so one of the exciting things I found at Hagley,
yes,
because I wanted to know if they'd ever met. So David Sarnoff was Jewish, came without much education, didn't get a high school degree. And McLuhan was Canadian, converted to Catholicism, very spiritual. Despite his reputation in the media world, he actually hated television, didn't want anything to do with it. But he wrote about it, and everybody assumed that meant he liked it. So that's sort of how it went. So I wondered if they bumped into each other. And in my hunts there, as sitting in that very nice room that you get to look out at the view, I keep wondering if there are any deer there, but I haven't seen any deer yet. I found, which was really great, a speech that David Sarnoff gave at Notre Dame University, which I believe is in Michigan. And it was an honorary degree, and he was obviously very pleased to have this degree. And he gave a speech going, you know, I don't have this, I've never went to school, means a lot to me. And he gave a talk about morality and about how the loss of spiritual life, not television, was the big issue, that we didn't have enough connection back to a spiritual energy. And this speech of his traveled quite a lot. And and that is where this quote came from, that McLuhan, that's one of the things I found, is where the quote actually came from. And it was, so it traveled around, and of course it was presented by one of the leading Catholic universities in the country. Indeed, his speech was presented by the provost, or the president, who was a well-known Catholic scholar. And at that time, McLuhan was also teaching in St. Louis in a Catholic college. So I said to myself, maybe there was some process. I will actually have to go to the McLuhan files, which are up in Toronto, to find out more on that one.
Well, it sounds like you found some great things.
I did.
how will you be able to use what you found in the collections for your project?
Yeah. So, well, the first thing I would say is that it actually started off a second topic, which is one of the lovely things about being able to be in an archive like that. In the process of doing this, I also found that David Sarnoff initiated the very first broadcast ever in the United States at the 1939 World Fair by filming the first ever presidential speech that was put on television. And that was very exciting to me. And indeed, I have gone on since then. I did some research there at Hagley, but I've gone on since then to start looking into that as well, because I think that also is part of the story of how television got established. Because in fact, David Sarnoff had also broadcast the first radio presentation by a president forever. And so that stimulated to me a whole discussion about the relationship between the media and the presidency that we talk about a lot now, but that apparently was happening in the 1920s. So to me, that was, so where is this going? So I have been collecting little bits and pieces for this, maybe even having to come back to Hagley for a little bit more. And I'm putting it together actually in this, as you introduced me into this concept of a screen time, of a sort of interactive exhibition. And what I'm trying to look at is the sort of place, following McLuhan, the place of the actual screen in our lives. So, and that goes back, believe it or not, one section of I'm working on is actually on Plato's Cave. So it goes way back, right?
Sure.
And some of it is looking at sort of shadow puppets, and then areas in which we changed the way we worked around the screen. But arguing really that we treat everything as somehow slightly new and dangerous, but in fact, we've been using a version of this format back to Plato's time. So I'm hoping to create a absolutely wonderful exhibition out of this interactive exhibition, preferably something on a bus that can go traveling. I'm of course waiting for Sony to write me a check for $2 million, which they haven't yet done. But that is where I would like to do it. I would like it to be something that's sort of tangible, that people can touch things and put themselves in the position of being relating to television. That's the idea.
Well, how do changes in the media affect social relations or affect the way we communicate? Whether it's the shift from print or radio to television, or perhaps even the shift more recently from screens being in our environment, but now they are ubiquitous.
Right.
What does this do to the way we relate to one another?
I think it's crucial, and but I think there are certain turning points that make things slightly different. I do think, you know, for a long time, the sense of being on being on TV was sort of dressing up and presenting yourself, and you really weren't very self-conscious. You were doing it, and then once we had cell phones, and scenarios like this. So I can see myself talking to you, right? That changes, do you know what I mean? That changes my perspective. I don't know if I'm talking to me or if I'm talking to you. So that changes it. The selfie, I think, changed things to that self-awareness. So I think one of the interesting things about the screen is, and the way that media works, is that it forces a question of your identity and what you're presenting. And, you know, we've had, so I don't know that the content certainly drives it, but it doesn't necessarily dictate it. So for example, in the 50s, there were only, you know, mostly very carefully edited TV shows, carefully edited films. Everything was exactly planned. This is how you're going to see it. Now you're just as likely to have somebody leave the camera on and you get to watch them drifting around their apartment for 24/7, you know. That is a technological change that breaks the frame, is what I call it. It breaks the frame of how we see ourselves. So I think we've moved, and this is McLuhan's argument, moved from a one-at-a-time experience of early media. You know, I read the newspaper, then I read the next page newspaper, to now we put all the media together. We listen to a podcast, we put the music on, we have this on, and we've pulled it all together into our multitasked world. And I don't think anybody really knows where that will go. People do argue that it's going to change the way we think. That our brains will have to start processing differently because we're asking our minds to maintain much more information.
And part of what you're suggesting with your work is that some of these mental mechanisms have a much deeper history.
Absolutely.
They're not entirely
we
novel.
Be too shocked about that a lot of the stuff that was when McLuhan wrote his media literacy piece was a sort of deep-seated moral, this isn't right, this isn't good, we're not doing a good thing principle, there's something wrong here, right? Against, of course, David Sarnoff's, which is, you know, absolutely not, you use it right and you be a good person and there's no problem with it. But if you actually think that the format that we use is the basis of plays, is the basis of shadow puppets, is the basis of many ways in which we frame our lives anyway, and that we've always been framing them as we come out, then then the argument that the media is the issue just doesn't hold. And that's what interests me. It's what it becomes is just a kind of like a coat hook to hang on the ills of today. You know, I mean, did people lie before the internet to each other? Yeah, I believe so. Did newspapers write things that weren't true? Yeah, absolutely. But somehow this new version has to be blamed as somehow being worse than the last one. That's how. So I'm not a reactionary, I think is the point. I don't see that it's I don't see that. I see this as a process, and I think that if we treat it the same way as we think about our knives and forks or the wheels of our car as a tool that we have adjusted to life, then it's an interesting approach.
Do you have any advice for people interested in media studies, for who may be coming to use the collections at Hagley or other business history collections?
Yeah, so I only explored the RCA collection and the Sonoff papers, of which there's at least 2 sections. There's also some marketing papers there too, which are very interesting of how people marketed products. I think, you know, the collection is very deep and it's extremely well presented online, so you have a good sense of it. But I am personally in favor of the sort of library principle where you open the box and, oh gosh, you didn't even think that was going to be interesting, but in fact, that's more interesting than what you thought you were going to look for. So I think that's very important. I also really appreciated that when I came to the library and found the actual speech that David Sarnoff gave at the first ever screening of a use of a television in the United States as a public, for the general public, that you actually had it. And that you were able to digitize it and put it for not just me, but for everybody to realize that that was that was available. That was really great.
Oh.
So I think there's advice, be a little prepared, because the negatives and all the visuals are somewhere else sometimes. So if you're there for a week, they may only just reach you by the end of the week, but they are all there. You just have to plan it. So I found it very helpful, and I found it pretty easy to get through, all the materials. I know that you keep having more and more materials given to you. No, I mean, lots of collections coming in, and sometimes they're parts of collections, like the Sonoff collection. I know that part of it was in Princeton University and then came to you. And I think there's another one, a part of it in another university somewhere in New Jersey. So I think people just have to, hunt. I think it's hunting. And but the materials are there, and they are both ideological. There's lots of materials about letters people wrote to each other and how ideas were influenced. And then there's all this technical stuff that's not my personal ability of, exactly how big television screens were, and how they made the electronics behind it. But that's another person's research.
Yeah, I like to say that archival research is both a team sport, or also there's also the thrill of the hunt, which is exactly what you were mentioning.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's a wonderful. I mean, it has a very good atmosphere, and it has a very, how can I say, a great place to feel like you could actually concentrate. Some libraries all feel a little busy, but this one felt very much like it had been set aside for researchers, and it was extremely easy to navigate, and it's a beautiful spot.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And for sharing your work.
Yeah, take care. Have a good day.
Likewise. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, you can go to our website at hagley.org. And you can also learn there more about the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and our research grants and fellowships. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Evans-Pritchard.
Delighted.
Take care.
Bye.